So, my name is Max Lugavere, health and science journalist, author, podcaster. I think it's like where I am on stage. Okay, so this is just a selection of a brief sort of overview of my body of work so far. In case you're unfamiliar with my work, I wrote a book called Genius Foods that came out in 2018, a sort of nutritional care manual for the human brain, if you will, at a time when came out at a time when that sort of insight was really lacking. And I describe it sometimes as the ultimate dementia prevention manual, the ultimate sort of care manual for the brain, if you will. And in it, I talk about nutritional psychiatry as well, so the role that food plays in mood. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about some of the basic tenets about how to protect your brain in accordance with the best available evidence, but also what the latest and best, most groundbreaking research has to say, because research evolves slowly, and it continually evolves. But there's been some really exciting studies to come out as of late, and so I'm excited to share those with you here today. But just getting back to what you see on the screen, so I wrote a book, cookbook called Genius Kitchen, which came out last year, actually. I host a podcast called The Genius Life. Does anybody listen to it? Okay, awesome. I get to do a lot of television in the States. This is me with Rachel Ray, who is a big TV personality there. This right down here is actually one of my proudest accomplishments, even though it was probably read by a couple dozen people. This is actually a chapter in a medical textbook that I had the privilege of getting to co-author with one of my mentors in science, Richard Isaacson, who's a neurologist who focuses on the clinical practice of dementia prevention. So I actually got to influence the way physicians practice dementia prevention, which is like this very new and exciting topic to me. And then my books have been published around the world, which has been nothing short of utterly gratifying. So before I get into the technicalities, the reason why I got into this is because my mother got sick at a very young age. I'm the firstborn in a very small family. I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and I didn't have dementia in my family tree. But when my mom was 58 years old, she started to display the earliest symptoms of what would ultimately be diagnosed as a rare and incurable progressive form of dementia called Lewy body dementia. Now, I want to be very clear, I didn't take the academic route to get to where I am today. I'm not a PhD, I'm not a medical doctor. I started as a generalist journalist, but when my mom became sick, I became obsessed with trying to understand everything that I possibly could about the etiology, right, the pathophysiology of conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which incidentally is now the #1 cause of death in the United Kingdom, as well as the ways that we can optimize our brains in the here and now. Because as a young person, I get it, right? Like dementia, cognitive decline, these are all abstract, esoteric concepts that are years, if not decades down the line, right? So how can we actually improve the way that our brains work today, in the here and now, so that we can be more successful in life, while also battening down the hatches to ensure a brighter future for ourselves and our loved ones for years and decades to come. So when my mom got sick, it was obviously a very traumatic thing for me to experience in my life. It was horrible, and it continued to be horrible for quite some time. But I started to look at the modern world and how far we've come from the days of yore, you know, when our hunter-gatherer ancestors had a lot less stress, their food supply was a lot less processed. And I started to learn that our food environment has essentially mutated, almost like a form of cancer in a way. I mean, you can walk down the aisles of any supermarket and find innumerable packaged, processed, shelf-stable foods, which now make up 60% of the calories that your average American consumes every day. I don't know what the exact number, the proportion is for Europeans, but I would imagine that it's somewhat nearby. Now today, about 73% of the food supply is ultra-processed. So that's just a massive proportion if you think about all of the very many items in the supermarket. Now, ultra-processed foods, what defines them are essentially, there are a few defining characteristics of ultra-processed foods. And the term ultra-processed, just so everybody's on the same page, was coined by a nutrient profiling system devised in Latin America called NOVA. And so NOVA was really this food categorization system that for the first time really coined this term, ultra-processed. What does that mean? Well, food processing is a continuum, right? When you take an apple and you slice it, you're processing it to some degree, right? So it's not that processed foods are inherently bad, but ultra-processed foods are foods that essentially you couldn't make in your own kitchen if you wanted to, right? They require huge plants to manufacture. And we're now starting to understand that these foods really are at the foundation of the pandemic of modern chronic non-communicable disease. This is actually a British family. So this is a family in the UK, and this is a week's worth of groceries. You have to squint, right, and use a magnifying glass almost to find the fresh food. So this is essentially like what we're eating day in and day out. Shelf-stable, nutrient-depleted, packaged processed foods. And actually, those are some of the core characteristics of these foods that make them so nefarious, is that they tend to be nutrient sparse, so depleted of any actual nutrition, and calorie dense. They also tend to have the characteristic known as hyperpalatability, which is essentially like they push your brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control is just futile. Anybody here have that experience of like going to the freezer, grabbing a pint of ice cream, intending only to have like a spoonful, and before you know it, you're looking at the bottom of the pint? Has anybody experienced that ever? I have. No shame in the game. This is a safe space. So anyway, that's like one of the most well-known characteristics of ultra-processed foods. They have this characteristic known as hyperpalatability. Now, in the United States, it's not much better. In fact, it's probably worse. So this is an American family, and again, you've got the ultra-processed foods, you've got the mixed dishes like pizza. Pizza, incidentally, is now in the American diet, it is the #1 source of dietary sodium, is pizza. It used to be bread and rolls, according to the CDC. Non-specific breads, commercial breads and rolls. Now it's pizza, the #1 source of dietary sodium. Unfortunately, we see that along with conditions like heart disease, cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, we are now starting to see that increased consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated with a starkly increased risk of the development of dementia. This is a very new study that found that for every 10% increment in ultra-processed food consumption, we see a 25% increased risk of the development of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. No bueno. Now, so one of, I think, the most fundamental recommendations to make, regardless of where in the world one lives, we want to reduce our consumption of ultra-processed foods, right? They tend to be loaded with added sugars, added fats, added sodium, which is not a bad thing, right? It's just that, most people today, the majority of their sodium intake comes from these sorts of foods, right? Which are, again, nutrient bereft and super, super calorie dense. We also have to look after our blood pressure. So I've started talking about this more and more. As one of the key modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia, I cannot underscore this enough. You want to avoid hypertension. Today in the United States, about 50% of adults have hypertension, otherwise known as high blood pressure, okay? And this is not just about sodium intake. Okay? Sodium is actually a macro mineral that we need to ingest on a daily basis. The demonization of sodium needs to stop, quite frankly. 11% of the sodium that your average Western adult ingests today comes from their salt shaker. The vast majority comes from restaurant food and these ultra-processed foods. So this was actually a seminal study in the field of dementia prevention that showed that when you took people who were at risk for cognitive decline, who had hypertension, and you aggressively treated their high blood pressure with drugs, mind you, but I'm going to get to why this is nonetheless empowering for people who would prefer not to use drugs, that they saw a significant risk reduction for mild cognitive impairment, which is sort of like the stage right before dementia. It's almost like they call it pre-dementia. So again, just to make it very clear, when people were treated for their high blood pressure, they saw improved brain health, reduced risk for mild cognitive impairment. Thankfully, meta-analyses have validated the fact that exercise is just as effective as drugs. So when it comes to protecting our brains, exercise really is medicine. This is one of these meta-analyses that have shown that, it hasn't directly connected this to the, you have to sort of connect the dots sometimes with this research, but this is very, very empowering. And very new research published over the past couple of months, January 2023 is when it came online. We see that actually resistance training is a powerful intervention to actually keep your blood pressure healthy. The key variable here is the intensity. So in this study, they found that resistance training only with moderate to vigorous load intensity at a frequency of at least 2 times per week and a minimum duration of 8 weeks was as effective as drugs in terms of ensuring healthier blood pressure. So super, super important. Now moving back to diet, diet obviously plays a major role in healthy blood pressure, and I'm a huge fan of dark leafy greens for many reasons. But in part because dark leafy greens are rich in compounds called nitrates. Has anybody here heard of nitrates? I mean, I think beets are pretty well known for being a high nitrate food. Dark leafy greens are actually one of the top sources, and per calorie, like for the calorie contribution, the relative calorie contribution from dark leafy greens, you don't really get much better. I mean, dark leafy greens are great. And in fact, research out of Rush University shows us that people who eat a bowl of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger. So you can have a more youthful brain by up to 11 years by eating a bowl of dark leafy greens every day, just a salad every day. Now, what is the mechanism behind that observational finding? Because correlation doesn't equal causation. Well, again, dark leafy greens are rich in nitrates, okay? So here we actually see 2 really interesting studies. One found that a high nitrate diet actually led to an improvement in blood flow, so perfusion to the part of the brain responsible for executive function. So executive function is like, think of it like the CEO of conscious thought, right? It helps with planning, decision-making, impulse control, getting stuff done, right? It's how that functionality of our brains really kind of focuses on the prefrontal cortex. It's sort of essentially housed in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And they saw that in the prefrontal cortex, there was an increase in blood flow in this randomized control trial where subjects were given either a high nitrate or a low nitrate diet. So dark leafy greens, again, an amazing source of these foods. Here we saw, this was another wonderful study, which found so this study was actually in older adults, and this one actually used younger, cognitively healthy adults that found that just one single high nitrate meal was potentially enough to boost cognitive function. So a lot of people always ask me like what my favorite nootropic is. I happen to love food as a nootropic. I mean, who'd have thought that just eating a salad rich in dark leafy greens could potentially have a cognitive boosting effect, right? Well, that's what these studies tend to suggest. Now here's the caveat, and I've talked about this quite a bit recently. I got to talk about this on the Joe Rogan podcast, which was super fun. Humans lack the enzymes required to convert the nitrates in dark leafy greens to their usable form in the body, nitrites, which then enter what's called the nitric oxide pathway, which is really what helps to boost blood flow, reduce blood pressure, and all the good things that we want, right, to derive when we consume a cardioprotective nitrate-rich diet. We actually rely on oral bacteria to do that job for us. So we have bacteria in our mouths that, as we chew dark leafy greens, actually get to work converting these compounds in fruit, in greens like arugula, or I think you call it rocket here, or kale, spinach, and what have you. They get to work converting those compounds, which actually immediately after we consume them and for about 90 minutes has a blood pressure lowering effect. The problem is about 40% of Americans use antiseptic mouthwash every day as part of their dental hygiene routine. And so I was at dinner last night, and my friend said, the gut starts in the mouth, which was a really brilliant way of thinking about this. It's absolutely true. And when we nuke the bacteria in our mouths on a daily basis, we're basically killing the bacteria that are required. Not just we co-evolved with them, and they help us to derive a cardioprotective effect from our foods. So for all intents and purposes, unless there's a medical recommendation, we want to avoid antiseptic and antibacterial mouthwashes to the best of our ability, because we're essentially sterilizing our mouths, which can have a negative impact on our blood pressure. We actually see that people who frequently use antiseptic mouthwash have a 50% increased risk for the development of diabetes and a doubling of risk for the development of hypertension. Now, more research needs to be done. These studies are correlational, and the populations involved were already not in the best health, but nonetheless, the mechanism is there. This was a randomized control trial where we actually saw that the use of antiseptic mouthwash after a workout session actually blunted. Remember, I was talking about how effective exercise is for reducing blood pressure and how important that is for the brain. This actually found that when we use mouthwash in the post-workout setting, we negate essentially some of those antihypertensive effects that we aspire to derive from exercise. Okay, so we've talked a bit about blood pressure and how important that is to keeping your brain performing optimally. Another of my favorite compounds found in dark leafy greens that, again, I think validate this, a mechanism that helps to validate this observation that people who consume dark leafy greens have more youthful, better performing brains, is that dark leafy greens are the top sources of compounds called carotenoids. So carotenoids are plant pigments. Lutein and zeaxanthin in particular are my favorites. And I think I really kind of broke the news on these two compounds in my first book, Genius Foods. These are compounds that are ubiquitous in the produce section of the supermarket. You can also find them in much lower concentrations in egg yolks, in grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and the like. But really, you don't get much more concentrated than this. Now, carotenoids, it's been long known for decades at this point that they can help protect our eyes from aging. So carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin in particular, at a dose of about 12 milligrams a day, it's been well established they can help prevent what's called age-related macular degeneration. So this is great. That's great news for eye health, right? But we now are starting to understand that our eyes are not separate from our brains. Our eyes actually contain neural tissue. Our eyes are an extension of our brains. And these same compounds actually aggregate in the brain, where they provide not just a protective effect, but a cognitive boosting effect. So here we see that lutein and zeaxanthin associated with better cognitive function across the aging spectrum. We see that they can enhance memory when given supplementally for people that are at risk of cognitive decline. And we also see that when given to young and healthy college students, this is it's like amazing when researchers give supplements to these young strapping college students and actually see an effect, because college students are already thought to be at the peak, right, of their cognitive potential, right? Only to begin depending on how many beers they've had in college, a slow, gradual decline, right, to the end of life. But what they saw in this study from the University of Georgia was that when you give young and healthy college students a dose of lutein and zeaxanthin, of about 34 milligrams a day, there was a boost in not just their visual processing speed, but a characteristic known as neural efficiency. So neural efficiency is really cool. And I actually had a slide. I kind of revised the deck, but it's not on this version of it, actually. But neural efficiency is a very interesting concept. And what they kind of, researchers are always trying to like distill salient human characteristics into something that they can like put on a graph. And what they find is that people who seem to be very intelligent, their brains seem to work less hard when doing the same task that somebody who, you know, perhaps doesn't seem as bright. Basically, the brain seems more intelligent, right? It's got like a bigger engine. So it actually is doing less work on brain scans when given the same task, right? And what they found is that lutein zeaxanthin actually can boost the efficiency of your brain. So for a given task, your brain has to work less hard to do it, which is actually an amazing thing because, you know, our brains are crucibles for oxidative stress. So if we can actually make them work more efficiently, hypothetically, I mean, that's a great thing. So as I mentioned, eggs are also, and I hope, is everything making sense so far, by the way? Because I know I'm going fast. I only have 40 minutes. And I really wanted to pack a lot into this presentation. But so egg yolks are another fantastic source of lutein and zeaxanthin. They're also, it's very bioavailable, even though the dose is a lot smaller in an egg yolk. The compounds are very bioavailable because egg yolks contain fat, and these are fat-soluble compounds. So whenever you're eating a bowl of dark leafy greens, you want to consume it with a fat source. Whether we're talking about salad dressing, you know, a piece of protein like grass-fed, grass-finished beef, some nuts on top, macadamias. You know, there's like lots of great options. You want to consume your dark leafy greens with a good fat source. But eggs are amazing, not just for the tiny amount of lutein and zeaxanthin that they contain. They are also one of the top sources of a compound called choline. So choline is actually a precursor molecule to a neurotransmitter in our brains called acetylcholine, which is really important for learning and memory. I remember when my mom had dementia, one of the drugs that was prescribed to her, which had no effect, was actually biochemically what it sought to do was raise levels of acetylcholine in the brain, which is a futile effort in the setting of dementia, I think. But here we see, from the standpoint of prevention, in men, that those with the highest intake of choline actually had reduced risk over 22 years for dementia by about 30%. Now, this is another really interesting study, in my view, because you often hear that, like, you know, animal products are like the worst thing for the brain, right? I'm very passionate about this topic because my mom was, in many ways, kind of like, she had a bias towards vegetarianism. And I have no idea, I'll never know whether or not that contributed to you know, the illness that she developed. But choline is found in both plants and animals, but it's found in much higher concentrations in animal products. It's found in huge amounts in liver, in egg yolks, as I mentioned, but also in beef. And so in a way, choline can be considered a surrogate marker, like a proxy almost, for animal food intake. And so, you know, people who ate the most choline, where does that choline come from, right? It comes from animal products for the most part. They saw a stark risk reduction for the development of dementia. And this was irrespective of whether or not they possessed what's called the ApoE4 allele, which about 1/4 of this room carries, myself included. It's the most well-defined risk factor for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions, incidentally, and cardiovascular disease as well. So here we see that regardless of that genetic risk factor, choline played a protective role. So that brings me to the red meat conversation. I mean, you know, we hear all the time red meat is so bad, it's clogging our arteries, it's the worst thing ever. And I actually looked into this. I'm very passionate about this topic Because, you know, I am genetically at risk for the development of dementia. And if I saw convincing evidence that red meat was destroying my brains and my brain and my vasculature, I mean, I probably wouldn't eat it. But the data is so weak when it comes to the health risks. And this data is incredibly old and based on some, contingent on some really prevalent biases in the field of nutrition, namely healthy user bias. So healthy user bias basically is like the concept that healthy habits tend to cluster together and unhealthy habits tend to cluster together as well. And so for the past couple of decades here in the United States, I'm not so sure about here in the UK or in Europe what the prevailing dogma has been, but we've been told for decades to avoid red meat, that the saturated fat contained in red meat is going to clog your arteries. And so we see that people who are more health conscious in the US tend to adhere to more meat avoidant diets. People who are more health conscious, you know, for their health, they're giving up meat, right? And so they tend to do other healthy things, right? They tend to work out more. Maybe they are more inclined to take a multivitamin, to get regular checkups at their doctors, to not smoke, to not drink as much alcohol, right? Whereas in the United States, meat eaters are more likely to smoke. They're more likely to be sedentary. They're more likely to not work out, to do other unhealthy things. So that's healthy user bias at work. And nonetheless, the associations that we see between red meat consumption and poor health outcomes still incredibly weak. Nonetheless, red meat is an incredibly important source of protein. And so that's one of the benefits that red meat has going for it, that it's a great source of protein. And we see that frailty is the #1 thing that we want to avoid if we want to age well. And so protein is crucial. We see that consumption of dietary protein is one of the most important tools when it comes to fighting frailty. Now, thankfully, newer research has come out really throwing this whole idea that red meat is not good for us into question. I actually think it's a health food. In fact, here we see 2021 UK Biobank study. Every additional 50 grams of unprocessed red meat per day was associated with a 20% lower risk of dementia and 30% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. So that's a dose response. What that suggests is more red meat, unprocessed red meat, better brain health. Another incredible food that we want to regularly consume is wild fatty fish. Mackerel, herring, sardines, salmon, all great options. Why? Well, they provide a compound called DHA fat in a form that is plug and play to the human body. DHA fat, we're starting to understand, is really important when it comes to the brain. Here was a study that actually looked at red blood cell concentration of DHA and found that those in the highest quintile of DHA fat compared to the lowest had a 50% lower risk for the development of dementia. So again, correlation doesn't equal causation, but we're starting to see that DHA, as one of the most important structural building blocks for the brain, crucially important. I don't have a ton of time left, unfortunately, but I do want to kind of like breeze through this portion, which I think is also very important, healthy fats. The brain is made of fat, and so the fats that we ingest on a daily basis, very relevant when it comes to the brain. Extra virgin olive oil, we're now starting to see, has a pronounced anti-inflammatory effect. This is a meta-analysis that looked at all the randomized control trials using extra virgin olive oil at a dose between 1 milliliter and 50 milliliters per day, and they saw a powerful anti-inflammatory effect, which is important because Alzheimer's disease and other chronic conditions are inflammatory in nature. How olive oil is made? You crush olives. How refined, industrially produced grain and seed oils are made? Well, you can see the steps. The deodorization step down there actually creates trans fats. So there's a number of issues that I have with this production process. All that is to say that we've been using extra virgin olive oil for many, many years as a species, hundreds of years. We see that people who eat mostly monounsaturated fat, which is the type of fat found primarily in extra virgin olive oil, they're LDL lipoproteins. So the lipoproteins that are associated with cardiovascular disease, that chart cholesterol and triglycerides around your body, are actually seem to be protected against oxidative modification, right? That's in the etiology of atherosclerosis we're talking about, if they ingest more extra virgin olive oil and less of the other stuff. Incidentally, there's, anybody ever hear of the Israeli paradox? This is very funny. Well, I don't know if funny is the right word. But basically, Israelis in Israel, they're the highest consumers of seed oils on the planet. They consume about 10% more than us in the United States. And we consume a lot. And despite them adhering to this, to consuming the oil with the red Heart Healthy logo on it, they see the same amount of heart disease and, in fact, higher rates of cancer. Fascinating. Now, when it comes to the brain, there are a lot of unanswered questions about the utter prevalence of these industrially refined grain and seed oils in our food supply. We don't know over the long term how they impact our brain. I'm on social media all the time, and this is a big contentious topic now. Are seed oils, the worst thing ever for us? Are they totally benign? We have very limited data. What we don't know is how they affect the brain over the long term. This was a great paper. If you want to take a photo of this, it's a review. It's open access, so anybody can read it, by Taha, published in 2021, I believe, that kind of highlights some of these lingering questions. But we see that, when people go on low seed oil diets, they have fewer migraines and the like. This is a study from Stockholm, Sweden. It's the world's first large population, long-term randomized control trial where they used a multimodal approach to try to improve cognitive function and reduce risk for cognitive decline in people who were already at risk, older adults at risk for the development of dementia. And they saw, when adhering to a diet, much like the diet I recommend, on my podcasts, on my Instagram, and my books, that they saw a 150% improvement in their processing speed and an 83% improvement in their executive function, even in old age. Striking. So that kind of closes out the food portion of my chat, but I do want to touch on briefly before I wrap that what you eat is still the most important variable when it comes to your health, but when you eat does matter. And so here is research showing that eating late at night, so out of the sort of schedule of our normal meal consistency, that we have increased hunger the next day. We see a reduction in our resting energy expenditure, and we see an increase in calorie consumption by a small but significant amount of calories. I think it was about 60 calories in this study. So when it comes to overall health, we do want to kind of be mindful of our body's innate circadian tendencies, and we're diurnal creatures. We're meant to eat during the day, not too late at night. When it comes to groundbreaking research, it's hard to ignore all the new literature coming out showing us how important walking is from the standpoint of brain health. This was a study that was just published that found that in older adults, both cognitively normal and those with mild cognitive impairment, that walking improved cognitive function and improved neural connectivity in this adult, older adult population. And then finally, breath work and de-stressing. So I'm actually not the biggest fan of breath work personally, but nonetheless, anything that you can do to reduce your stress levels, crucially important. This was a study where they had a very diverse population. They found that breath work, to really engage the parasympathetic nervous system, actually had a marked impact on Alzheimer's disease-related biomarkers in blood. So we don't yet know how that associates with amyloid levels in our brains, but they are, of course, thought to be correlated. And so, the fact that we can, with simple breath work, right, 20 minutes a day, twice a day, which I'll admit, that sounds like quite a bit of breath work to do, but nonetheless, it's something so simple, right, can have such a pronounced effect. Another really effortless, easy thing to do, which I know many of us are fans of here in this room probably, is sauna use. Sauna fans? All right, love that, love that. Here we see that regular sauna use, again, a dose response associated with a dramatic risk reduction for the development of Alzheimer's disease. Also helps to reduce blood pressure. So going back to blood pressure, dramatic risk reduction for hypertension, for stroke, for cardiovascular disease, for early mortality, and ultimately also for Alzheimer's disease. Incredible stuff. So that was a very quick overview, but there was a lot of information there. I hope you enjoyed it. I could have kept going, but it's so great to be here, and thank you again to Tim and team for having me. I'm going to be signing books, so I'd love to come and meet you guys. My name is Max Lugavere. Feel free to connect with me, listen to the podcast. Thank you so much. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.